The day began the way most summer days did in the Texas hill country, heavy air trembling with heat, the sky wide and bleached, cicadas droning like a restless choir. The ranch stretched endless in every direction, pasture and cedar trees rolling toward the horizon, fences shimmering in the distance. James Callahan, the rancher, knew the rhythm of such days by heart. His boots hit the dry earth at sunrise, and by mid-afternoon, sweat traced deep lines down his weathered face as he checked on the herd. He had lived his life on this land, long enough to know every gate, hinge, and watering trough, long enough to believe there was little left that could surprise him. That certainty shattered in an instant. He was leaning to mend a fence post when the sound reached him first, the dry, unmistakable rattle. Before his eyes had time to focus, before his muscles could respond, the strike came. A flash of motion from the dust at his boots, a sharp pain tearing through his calf. He stumbled back, heart hammering, and saw the coiled rattlesnake vanish into the brush as if it had never been there. The puncture wounds burned like fire, a pain that did not stay still but traveled, searing upward into his leg. James gritted his teeth and tried to will it away, tried to think of all the times he had shrugged off cuts, bruises, even broken bones. But this was different. By the time his son, Caleb, heard his father's cry and ran across the field, James was already on his knees, vision tilting, breath sharp and shallow. Caleb dropped to his side, the sight of the swelling and darkening flesh twisting his face in panic. "Dad!" he shouted, voice cracking against the still air. The ranch hands were still scattered on other chores, too far to matter in this moment. Caleb's mind spun. The nearest hospital was nearly 2 hours away, the road rough and winding. Every instinct screamed that time was already slipping away. Back at the house, the family gathered in frantic confusion. The matriarch, Martha, clutched a dish towel in her trembling hands, as though it could somehow stand in for control. She had lived long enough to know what snakebite could mean. The phone was already in Caleb's hand, dialing every number he thought might bring help. Emergency dispatch promised an ambulance, but the dispatcher's voice admitted the truth. Response time would be too long. Every second counted, and James didn't have hours. And then, as if drawn into the story by fate itself, a figure appeared none of them expected. Sarah Whitmore had been driving down the county road in her old pickup, dust billowing behind her tires. A nurse by training, she was between assignments, stopping briefly in town before heading further south. When she saw the flurry of movement at the ranch and heard the panicked calls, something inside her urged her to pull in. She stepped from the truck with a steady stride, her presence foreign yet strangely grounding amid the chaos. "I'm a nurse," she said, voice clear and calm, the kind of tone that cut through panic. "What happened?" The family's words tumbled over one another, desperate, uneven. But the moment Sarah's eyes landed on James, she saw the truth faster than they could explain. She knelt at his side, examining the puncture marks, noting the spreading discoloration, the trembling of his hand as he clutched at the earth. She asked for supplies with precision, clean cloth, water, a knife, anything that could be spared, and in that barnyard turned triage, she began what would become the fight of her life. The Callahans looked on with a mixture of hope and fear. To them, she was a stranger who had simply stepped out of the dust, yet she handled their father as though she had known him for years. Every movement was deliberate, applying pressure, calming his breath, speaking not only to him, but to the fear that gripped the family. She told them what to expect, what could go wrong, and what she might be able to do. Her words did not erase their fear, but they gave it shape, gave it boundaries, and that in itself felt like a kind of miracle. The pain raged in James's body, venom running its course like a storm he could not outpace. He knew enough to sense the stakes. He felt his strength slipping, each heartbeat harder won. Yet in the midst of that haze, he noticed something in the nurse's face. Not panic, not pity, but focus. A determination that reminded him of the way he himself had once faced wildfires, droughts, and blizzards. She was not from this ranch, but she carried the same grit. As the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched long across the pasture, Sarah's hands worked tirelessly. She slowed the Venom's march with improvised measures, turned the tools of a ranch household into instruments of survival. Each step she took seemed to defy what the family thought possible, and though none of them could know yet how the night would end, a quiet realization began to settle among them. They might have found hope in the most unlikely of arrivals. The barn smelled of hay, dust and the faint sweetness of livestock feed, an ordinary scent that now mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Sarah's voice carried through the dim space, crisp and sure like a compass guiding them through terrain none of them had ever wished to travel. "Lay him down flat," she instructed Caleb, who half-carried, half-dragged his father onto a bed of stacked hay bales she quickly cleared. James groaned, the sound more animal than human, his boots dragging in the dirt before settling. "Light," Sarah said firmly, and Martha fumbled for a lantern. Its glow was thin, but enough to cast her patient's swollen leg into stark relief. Already, the skin around the puncture had darkened to a bruised purple, swelling fast enough that even those with no medical training could see time was an enemy closing in. Sarah unrolled her small travel bag, the one she carried everywhere, a modest thing compared to a hospital's arsenal, but filled with the essentials she refused to be without. Gauze, alcohol wipes, a stethoscope, bandages, nothing extraordinary, but everything she had. Caleb hovered, restless hands flexing at his sides. "Shouldn't we be taking him to the hospital?" "My truck's out front." "We can drive." "You'd never make it in time," Sarah cut in, not unkindly but with the weight of certainty. "Every mile you spend on that road gives the Venom a head start. Right now, the best chance he has is here, with us." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, steady as a plumb line. Caleb wanted to argue, but something in her gaze pinned him. She worked methodically, washing the bite with water drawn from a tin pail. Her movements efficient but tender, as if she knew the earth itself was watching. She wrapped James's leg to slow the spread, careful not to cut off circulation, then positioned him so gravity would work in their favor. The tools were humble, the setting far from sterile, yet the barn became something else under her care. A battlefield hospital, a sanctuary, a fragile bridge between life and loss. James's breathing grew shallow, each inhale a mountain to climb. Sarah leaned close, speaking in a calm murmur only he could hear. "Stay with me. You've weathered storms worse than this, haven't you?" His lips moved as though to answer, though no sound came. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the erratic drum of his heart, and glanced toward Martha. "Talk to him. Keep him here. He needs to hear familiar voices." So Martha began, haltingly at first, her voice brittle like old wood. She spoke of the cattle drive 2 summers ago, when James had refused to come inside during the lightning storm, until every last steer was safe. She spoke of the porch he had built by hand, board by board, so they could watch the sunsets together. Her words trembled, but the memories filled the barn with a warmth that fought back the shadows. Sarah shifted her attention to the swelling, noting the way it crept, inch by inch. She needed more than supplies. She needed time, and the body was a clock that would not stop ticking. Improvisation was no longer a choice. It was the only path forward. She asked for a clean belt, a sharp knife, a bucket of ice if they had it. Caleb raced to gather what he could, his fear sharpening into action under her commands. When he returned, Sarah explained her plan with a directness that startled them. "I can't remove the venom completely, not here, but I can slow it. There are methods, old ones, risky ones, but better than doing nothing." Her words hung heavy, and Martha clutched the lantern tighter. "What do you mean, risky?" Caleb pressed, his jaw taut. "Risky if done wrong," Sarah admitted, "but I've trained for moments like this. If I succeed, it buys him hours, maybe enough. If I fail..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The silence of the barn filled the gap. Finally, James stirred, his voice a rasp like wind over gravel. "Do it." One hand weakly lifted, brushing his son's sleeve. "Listen to her." And so, under the dim glow, with the family forming a ring around her, like witnesses at an unspoken trial, Sarah began. Her hands were steady, her breaths measured, and though the tools at her disposal were crude, her confidence filled the gaps left by missing equipment. She worked with precision born not only of training, but of resolve, transforming the barn into a stage of both terror and awe. The Callahans could do nothing but watch. Every movement Sarah made seemed at once ordinary and extraordinary. A woman working with threadbare means, yet somehow holding the line between death and survival. What stunned them most was not the blood or the swelling, not even the venom she carefully worked to draw away. It was the stillness in her, the way her face betrayed no fear, as though she were rooted as deeply as the oaks that marked their land. When she finally leaned back, her shoulders damp with sweat. The rancher's leg was bound and tended. His pulse steadied, if only slightly. She looked up at the family, lantern glow painting her face with shadows. "It's not over," she said, her voice firm, "but we've bought him some time." The barn exhaled as one, a collective release of air no one realized they were holding. Martha pressed her hand to her mouth, tears shining unshed. Caleb nodded, his throat working, the weight of helplessness easing if only for a heartbeat. Outside, the cicadas droned on, indifferent to the battle waged within. For now, James Callahan lived. For now, hope still held. But in Sarah's heart, she knew the hardest hours were yet to come. Night had settled across the ranch with a quiet that was anything but peaceful. The stars spread wide and sharp above, a clear Texas sky that should have been beautiful. But inside the barn, the air was thick with unease. The lantern flickered, throwing long shadows across the wooden beams, and every shadow seemed to echo the same question. Was James Callahan truly safe, or had they only delayed the inevitable? Sarah sat close to him, watching with a nurse's eye, counting breaths, measuring the heat of his skin with the back of her hand, noting every tremor and twitch. His pulse was weaker than she wanted, but steady enough to keep her fighting. She had learned long ago that medicine was not always about miracles. Sometimes it was about holding the line long enough for the body to choose life. Still, as the minutes stretched into hours, she felt the weight of the family's eyes pressing into her back. Martha had not moved from her husband's side. She held his hand, whispering prayers beneath her breath, prayers that sounded less like requests and more like bargains with the heavens. Caleb paced the barn, boots scuffing the dirt, his worries sharpening into suspicion. His younger sister, Emily, had slipped in quietly with a blanket and a jug of water, her wide eyes darting between Sarah's careful work and her father's pale face. The barn had become both refuge and prison, its walls trapping them in a vigil none could escape. Caleb finally broke the silence, his voice low but edged with frustration. "How do we know this is working? How do we know you're not just stalling?" He stopped his pacing to face Sarah, his jaw set hard. "You said you've trained for this, but out here? With a pocket knife and a belt. Forgive me if I have doubts." Sarah did not look up immediately. She adjusted the bandage around James's calf, then spoke with the same calm she had carried since her arrival. "You're right to doubt. Doubt keeps you sharp, but listen to his breathing, slower than before. Look at the color in his lips. He's holding on. That's not chance. That's the body responding." Caleb's brow furrowed, torn between what his eyes told him and the knot of fear twisting in his chest. He wanted to believe her, but he also wanted to guard against false hope. Hope, after all, could break a man faster than loss when it proved empty. Martha's voice rose, weary but firm. "She's the reason he's still with us, Caleb, don't you see? If she hadn't come—" Her words faltered, but the silence said what she could not finish. Sarah finally turned to face them, lantern light catching the sweat on her temples. "I can't promise he'll be out of danger before the night is over. Venom doesn't bargain. It doesn't care about promises or prayers. But I can promise you this, I won't stop. Not until he's past the worst of it." Her conviction steadied the air, but the tension did not vanish. Instead, it shifted, softer now, like a rope still taut but no longer fraying. The hours dragged. Sarah asked Emily to keep bringing fresh water to cool James's forehead. Simple tasks that gave the girl something to do besides tremble in the corner. She asked Caleb to check the lantern's oil, to bring her strips of cloth cut from old shirts, to press his hand against his father's arm so she could measure the difference between warmth and fever. She involved them not because she lacked hands, but because she knew participation could transform fear into purpose. Even so, doubt whispered at the edges. Martha caught herself staring at the nurse's movements, trying to decide if they were deliberate or desperate. Emily, too young to mask her feelings, asked in a small voice, "Will he really get better?" The question lingered unanswered until James groaned softly, as though to remind them all that he was still fighting. Around midnight, Sarah leaned back against a beam, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. She knew she could not falter. The family needed to see endurance, not fatigue. But in her mind, memories stirred. Patients lost in faraway clinics where medicine had arrived too late. The helpless ache of watching life slip away despite her efforts. She shook the images off like unwanted dust. Tonight had to be different. Tonight, she would not let the venom write the ending. The barn creaked in the cool night wind. Outside, coyotes called from distant hills, their cries rising like a reminder of the wilderness pressing at the ranch's borders. Inside, the Callahans drew tighter around their patriarch, clinging not only to him, but to the woman who had walked into their lives out of nowhere and taken charge of a fate that had seemed sealed. Toward dawn, James stirred again, more fully this time. His eyelids fluttered and a faint sound escaped his throat, an attempt at speech. Sarah leaned close, urging him softly, "Save your strength. You're still with us. That's all that matters." His lips cracked into the ghost of a smile, barely there, but enough to ignite something in the room. Martha wept openly, pressing her forehead to his arm. Caleb stood rigid, his fists tight, torn between relief and disbelief. Emily whispered, "He's awake," as if the words themselves might anchor the fragile moment. For the first time since the rattlesnake's strike, the barn felt less like a waiting room for death and more like a cradle of survival. Hope, fragile and flickering, had returned, but so too had its shadow. No one yet knew whether this was the start of recovery or simply the calm before the venom surged again. As the first light of morning seeped through the cracks in the barn walls, Sarah knew the next hours would demand even more of her, more than training, more than skill. She would need to draw from the quiet reservoir of strength that had carried her through every trial before. And as the rooster crowed from the yard, breaking the long night, she glanced at the Callahans and saw it in their eyes. They were beginning to believe in her. But belief was fragile, and the venom was patient. The real test was only beginning. The morning sun rose hard and unrelenting, pouring light over the ranch as though the earth itself were determined to go on, indifferent to the fragile struggle inside the barn. The roosters crowed, cattle lowed in the fields, and the ordinary rhythm of ranch life pressed forward, yet within those wooden walls, time had taken on a different shape. Every minute felt stretched, weighted, trembling between survival and surrender. Sarah crouched at James Callahan's side, her eyes scanning every detail of his condition. The swelling in his leg had slowed but not stopped. His pulse, though still faint, had grown erratic. She noted the color of his lips, the sound of his breath, the way his eyelids twitched as if caught between sleep and fight. Venom was not only in his blood but in the air around them, invisible yet suffocating, dictating every choice she made. "His fever's rising," she murmured, wiping his brow with a cloth Emily had dipped in cool water from the pump. The girl's small hands trembled as she wrung it out, but she obeyed Sarah's instructions without hesitation. Martha clutched her husband's hand tightly, her lips moving in quiet prayers that seemed more like whispers to herself. Caleb, restless as ever, leaned against the doorframe, staring out at the brightening fields. The sight of another normal day unfolding only deepened the ache in his chest. How could the world look so unchanged when his father's life dangled by a thread inside a dusty barn? Sarah broke the silence. "We need to keep him hydrated." "Venom dehydrates the body quickly and fever makes it worse." She motioned to Martha. "Try to get him to sip, even if it's just a little." Martha lifted the tin cup to James's lips. At first the water dribbled down his chin, but then his throat worked, a swallow weak but real. Relief spread across her face, tears mixing with a shaky smile. "He drank," she whispered, as though speaking too loudly might undo it. But Sarah saw more. She saw the tremor in his hand, the strain in every swallow. The venom was still pressing forward. Slowing wasn't enough. They needed to fight back harder. Yet she had no anti-venom, no sterile room, no machines to monitor every vital sign. She had only instinct, knowledge, and the fragile trust of a family clinging to her presence like a rope in floodwaters. Caleb's frustration finally cracked. "This isn't enough," he said, his voice rising with the weight of fear. "We can't just sit here watching him slip away. There has to be more we can do." Sarah looked at him, her face calm but unyielding. "There is more, but it won't look like what you're expecting. Out here, we use what we have, not what we wish for. That's the only way to win this fight." Her words struck him like a fence post driven into the earth, immovable, firm. He wanted to argue, to shout that they should be on the road to a hospital, but when he looked at his father's ashen face, he knew she was right. The hours on the road could be the hours that ended him, so Sarah put them all to work. Emily kept the cloths cool, trading them out each time the fever threatened to climb higher. Caleb cut strips of clean fabric, his strong hands clumsy at first, then more efficient as Sarah showed him how to fold them into proper bandages. Martha prepared a mixture of broth, coaxing her husband to take in small sips of salt and water, feeding his body the strength it needed to endure. Slowly, the barn became less a place of waiting and more a place of action. Each family member carried a role, their fear transformed into purpose. Sarah's voice guided them through every step, her calm authority steady as the beat of a drum. But beneath that steadiness, her own heart raced. She knew what venom could do, how it could linger in the body, breaking down tissues, overwhelming organs. She thought of the textbooks she had studied, the clinical procedures she had memorized, the sterile tools she once held in brightly lit hospitals. Here she had none of those. Here, her only arsenal was creativity, resolve, and the fierce will not to fail. At one point, James stirred, his cracked voice rasping through the barn. Don't let them see me like this." His eyes, cloudy but still carrying a spark, flicked toward his children. Sarah bent close. "What they see is a man fighting harder than most could. Don't mistake that for weakness." Her tone carried no softness, only truth, and somehow he seemed to take comfort in it. By afternoon, the fever had broken slightly, beads of sweat marking his skin like proof of battle. Martha let out a sob of relief, clutching Sarah's hand as though it were a lifeline. Caleb exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. Emily's face lit with a fragile smile. But Sarah did not allow herself to relax. "This is good," she admitted, "but the venom isn't gone. It can come in waves. We can't let our guard down," the family nodded, subdued. Hope was a flame they could not afford to let burn too wildly. It needed to be tended carefully, lest it turn into disappointment's crueler fire. As evening approached, the Callahans watched their father sleep, his breaths shallow but even, his body finally resting after hours of turmoil. Sarah stood apart for a moment, gazing out through the barn doors at the horizon, where the sun melted into gold and crimson. She knew this fight was not over. In fact, the next hours could still tip the balance. But as she turned back to see the family keeping vigil, their hands steady, their fear tempered into action, she felt something shift. The battle was no longer hers alone. The Callahans were no longer just waiting for a nurse to save their patriarch. They were part of the saving. And together, they might just outlast the venom. The second night came heavy and slow, draping itself over the ranch like a thick quilt that refused to give warmth. The family had scarcely slept the night before, and fatigue hung over them like dust after a cattle drive. Still, none dared to leave James Callahan's side. His breaths were shallow but steady, his color faintly improved, and for the first time since the rattlesnake's strike there was a glimmer of something more than survival. There was the suggestion of recovery. Sarah knew better than to name it too soon. She had seen too many patients swing between hope and despair in the space of an hour. Yet she also knew the power of letting the smallest seed of optimism take root. Hope could steady trembling hands, sharpen tired minds, and give weary bodies the will to keep trying. And here, in a barn that had become their makeshift sanctuary, the Callahans needed that seed more than anything. Martha was the first to sense it. As she pressed a cool cloth to her husband's forehead, she whispered, "He looks less pale, doesn't he?" Her eyes searched Sarah's face, desperate for confirmation. Sarah nodded, cautious but honest. "His body is holding better than it was yesterday." "That's a good sign." Emily smiled faintly, her shoulders easing. She had clung to Sarah's every word as though each sentence was a rope pulling her from quicksand. Caleb, though still guarded, leaned closer than he had before, no longer pacing the barn like a restless sentinel. Even he could not ignore the small changes, the steadier pulse, the quieter fever, the occasional flicker of recognition in his father's eyes. But venom was not a foe that gave up quickly. It clung, it lingered, it tested every boundary. By midnight, James's breathing deepened, a sound that made Martha clasp his hand tighter. His eyes fluttered open, clearer this time, and when he spoke the words were hoarse but steady. "You all look worse than me." The family froze, then broke into soft laughter, laughter that carried the weight of tears. Martha leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. Emily whispered, "Daddy," with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Caleb turned away briefly, pretending to adjust the lantern, but Sarah saw the tremor in his shoulders, the way relief crashed into him like a wave. Sarah leaned close, checking his vitals once more. "You gave us a scare," she said quietly, her voice firm but not without warmth. "But you're not out of the woods yet. Rest. Let your body do its work." James's gaze shifted to her, lingering longer than before. His lips curved into the faintest smile. You're not from here, but you stayed." "I stayed because you needed me," she answered simply, "and because leaving wasn't an option." His eyes closed again, but the words lingered, weaving into the fabric of the barn's silence. For the first time, the Callahans seemed to see Sarah not as a stranger who had stumbled into their crisis, but as the thread that had kept their family from unraveling. The hours passed, and the nurse continued her vigilant watch. She taught Caleb how to check his father's pulse properly, guiding his large calloused fingers with her smaller, steady ones. She showed Emily how to count breaths, how to listen for signs of strain. She instructed Martha on how to keep fluids balanced, how to tell when rest was healing and when it was danger. Every task became a lesson, every moment a chance to share the burden. By dawn, the change was undeniable. James's fever had lessened. His skin, though still marked by the Venom's toll, carried more color. His breathing was not the ragged fight it had been, but something closer to normal. The Callahans felt it deep in their bones. The tide was turning. The relief was overwhelming, yet with it came a new kind of silence. For 2 days they had lived in the storm of fear, every second filled with action and urgency. Now, as James seemed to edge back toward life, the family was left with the quiet question of what came next. Could they allow themselves to trust the recovery? Could they believe that the Venom had truly loosened its grip? Sarah watched them closely, her own heart caught between exhaustion and guarded pride. She had fought hard in barns, clinics, and roadside emergencies, but few moments had carried this weight. Here in the stillness of a Texas ranch, she had helped bend fate's cruel hand. And she had done it not alone, but with the raw courage of a family that refused to give up. When the sun rose high and poured light through the barn slats, Martha reached for Sarah's hand. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice breaking with gratitude. Sarah shook her head gently. "We saved him. All of us, together." Caleb, who had said little, finally met her eyes. The suspicion that had once burned in him was gone, replaced with something quieter, heavier. Respect. "I doubted you," he admitted. "But if not for you, I don't even want to think about it." Sarah gave a small smile. "What matters is that he's here, and that he still has fight in him." The family gathered closer to James, who stirred again, this time with more strength. His eyes opened, sweeping over the faces of his wife and children, then landing once more on the nurse who had become their anchor. He whispered, voice still faint but steady, "Guess I owe you more than I can repay." Sarah shook her head, adjusting the blanket over him. "Just rest. That's repayment enough." Outside, the ranch stretched vast and unchanging, cattle grazing under the sun, fences standing tall, wind whispering through the oaks. But inside the barn, everything had changed. The Callahans no longer saw the space as a place of fear. It had become a place of deliverance, of resilience, of a story they would tell for years to come. The Venom had not vanished completely. It still lurked, a shadow that could return, but the balance had shifted. The storm had broken. For the first time, the Callahans could breathe without counting every inhale. And Sarah, though weary to her core, allowed herself one long exhale of relief. The rancher's family had begun to believe in his survival, and she, too, finally believed it. The third morning dawned softer than the last, its light spilling across the pastures in a wash of pale gold. The cicadas had quieted, replaced by the rustle of cattle in the distance and the creak of wood as the barn slowly warmed to the day. For the first time since the rattlesnake had struck, the Callahans did not wake to the sound of panic or fevered breath. They woke to something else entirely, the steady rhythm of survival. James Callahan was alive, not merely clinging, not teetering on the edge, but alive with strength returning to him like water filling a dry creek bed. He opened his eyes with more clarity, his voice no longer just a rasp, but a sound that carried the weight of a man still rooted in the earth. "Coffee," he whispered, his lips curling faintly. "Somebody get me coffee before I start thinking I've crossed over." The barn erupted with laughter, weak, relieved, almost incredulous laughter that rolled through the family like a tide. Martha pressed her face into his shoulder, tears soaking through his shirt as she laughed and cried all at once. Emily clapped her hands, unable to contain the joy bubbling in her chest. Caleb, who had carried his doubt like armor these past days, let out a long breath that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. Sarah allowed herself a smile, though she tempered it with her nurse's caution. "No coffee yet," she told him, adjusting his bandages with practiced care. "Your body isn't ready for that kind of rebellion. Broth and water first. Coffee later." James gave her a look that might have been a protest, but even he didn't argue. His eyes softened, studying the stranger who had become somehow the center of their survival. "I never thought a nurse would walk into my barn and keep me from meeting my maker," he said quietly. "You did more than patch me up. You gave me back time." Sarah lowered her gaze, her hands stilling over his bandaged leg. "Time is all any of us can give," she replied. "What you do with it, that's yours." The family moved around him now with lighter steps, each taking turns helping him sip broth, adjusting the blankets, even joking in ways that had felt impossible 2 days ago. Sarah guided them gently, ensuring every action kept him on the slow but sure road to healing. Her voice was still the anchor, but it no longer carried the strain of holding back disaster. It carried steadiness, assurance, the quiet authority of someone who had seen storms pass and leave the sky clear again. By late afternoon, James asked to sit up. With Caleb's strong arms bracing him and Martha fussing with pillows, Sarah allowed it, watching carefully for any signs of dizziness. He managed it, his back straight against the hay bales, his eyes sweeping across the barn as though seeing it for the first time. The place where he had nearly died was now the place where he had begun again. "Never thought my own barn would turn into a hospital," he said, his voice tinged with dry humor. "It was more than a hospital," Martha whispered, her hand resting on his. "It was where we learned we weren't as alone as we thought." Sarah caught the weight of her words and felt something stir in her chest. She had been many things in her career, an outsider stepping into chaos, a steady hand in the midst of strangers' crises, but rarely had she been welcomed in this way. The Callahans were no longer looking at her as someone who had simply passed through. They were looking at her as part of their story. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the fields in shades of copper, the family gathered outside the barn. James, too weak to walk, remained inside, but the door was propped open so he could hear their voices. Martha lit a lantern on the porch, and Caleb brought out a battered guitar he hadn't touched in months. He strummed quietly, his voice rough but warm as he sang a tune their father loved. Emily joined in, her small voice weaving with his, and Martha's laughter floated through the night like the chime of an old bell. Sarah stood slightly apart, leaning against the barn doorframe, the cool wood at her back. She listened to the music, the laughter, the stories that spilled into the night. Stories of ranch mishaps, of storms weathered, of triumphs and losses that bound this family to the land. And though she knew she would not stay, she felt the weight of being woven, if only for a brief time, into their tapestry. Later, when the family grew quiet and the stars crowded the sky, James called out softly from his makeshift bed. "Nurse?" Sarah stepped closer. "Yes?" "You didn't just save my life," he said, his voice thick with the gravel of emotion. "You reminded my family what we can be together. We'd forgotten that, until you showed us." Her throat tightened, and for once she had no words. She simply placed her hand over his, squeezing gently, the gesture carrying everything she could not speak. By morning, Sarah knew it was time to go. Her path lay elsewhere, with other roads to travel, other lives that might one day need saving. She packed her modest bag, her tools cleaned and tucked away, and stepped quietly toward her truck. But before she could leave, Martha intercepted her, pressing a folded piece of paper into her hand. "Our family owes you more than thanks," she said softly. "But since thanks is all we have, take this. It's our story now, and you're in it always." Sarah unfolded the paper later, miles down the road. It was a simple note written in Martha's careful script. "The day the rattlesnake struck, God sent us a nurse." And when she walked away, she left us not only a husband and father, but a reminder that miracles don't always come with trumpets. They sometimes come with steady hands and quiet courage. Sarah folded the note and tucked it into her bag, her eyes on the endless ribbon of road stretching before her. Back on the ranch, the Callahans would tell the story for years to come, how a stranger became their only hope, how she pulled venom and fear from their lives, how she turned a barn into a place of healing. Around campfires and kitchen tables, her name would rise again and again, stitched into the fabric of their history. And though she had driven away, her story had not ended. It had only been handed off, carried now by the voices of those who had lived through the long nights and watched the tide turn. From that day on, the Callahans had a story keeper, and it began with a nurse who had been more than chance, more than skill. She had been their only hope.